I applaud your vigilance and fortitude to come back after dinner. Welcome to the evening session and the last session of the day. So tonight we have Eleonore Stump from St. Louis University, and she is going to speak on the problem of evil and the history of peoples, Think Amalek, and then the comments will be from Paul Draper from Purdue.
Writing about Benjamin Netanyahu in the New York Times, May 17, 2009, the journalist Jeffrey Goldberg says, quote, "I recently asked one of his advisors to gauge for me the depth of Mr. Netanyahu's anxiety about Iran. His answer, think Amalek. Amalek is Hebrew for existential threat," unquote. It is amazing that so many centuries after the battles between the Amalekites and the Israelites, the biblical stories of the Amalekites should still have so much influence. But if the biography of any one human being is a complicated affair, the histories of peoples are very much more tangled. In this case, although the Amalekites and the Israelites are ancestral enemies, in fact, in the biblical stories, both peoples are part of the same family. The progenitor of the Amalekites was born to one of the sons of Esau, the twin brother of Jacob, who was one of the ancestors of the whole Israelite people. So in the stories, the Amalekite people and the Israelite people are cousins of a sort, at least in their origins. In this paper, I want to look at one episode in the enduring history of these two related peoples, namely the story told in 1 Samuel of Samuel and the Amalekites. This story raises the problem of evil in a particular and powerful way that prompts loathing of religion in some people, as we've heard already in this conference. And it's more difficult to deal with than the usual examples illustrating the problem of evil, at least partly because the protagonists in the story include whole peoples. I'm going to deviate from the text that you have, the long version that you have. I have to because I have time limits for the reading draft. Where the deviation is small, I won't say. Where it's large, I'll clue you. The story's too long to reproduce here, given the time limits for the papers, although you have it in your long version. But here's what I take to be the most salient bits of the story. In the story, through the prophet Samuel, God commands Saul and the Israelite people to attack the Amalekite people and to kill all of them, together with all of their animals. Saul and the Israelite people carry out this divinely commanded plan, except that they save Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and all the best of the animals. At that point, a very angry Samuel returns to tell Saul that since Saul has rejected God's command, God has rejected Saul as king. And after going on for a bit, the story finishes with Samuel himself killing Agag. So that's the story. Now I'm skipping the section on reactions to the story and resuming on page 44. This story, as I said, is a good example of stories in the Hebrew Bible that prompt outrage in many contemporary readers. The story presents God, a God who is supposed to be good, as commanding the Israelites to kill every human being among the Amalekites, including the children, and to slaughter all the animals. Why shouldn't we, that is, why shouldn't I, reject this story as non-veridical and morally repellent? In this paper, I want to approach this question by doing a thought experiment. I want to consider a putatively possible world which is very similar to the actual world and which includes the existence of evil, but in which the central claims of Christianity are true. I say putatively possible because I recognize that in virtue of the problem of evil, some people think there is no such possible world. With this putatively possible world briefly and partially described, I want to ask whether the story of Samuel and the Amalekites could be true in a world of that sort. In the putatively possible world of the thought experiment, there is an omniscient, omnipotent, perfectly good God who created the world and governs it. Human beings are also created by God, and they are everlasting. They do not cease to exist at bodily death. God loves everything that he has made, and he desires all human beings to be united to him in love forever. But because human beings have free will in some libertarian sense, even God cannot unilaterally bring about union between himself and a human person. For there to be such union, a human person has to be willing to be united to God. His will has to be in accord with the will of a perfectly good God. Everything that happens in this world happens in accordance with God's will, at least in the sense that God permits it, even if he permits it only in light of what human beings themselves will. Finally, in this world, there is an objective moral standard for human beings. That standard is in accordance with God's will, and God communicates it to human beings by one means or another. Among other things, this divinely willed and communicated moral standard forbids murder as incompatible with God's will. It also mandates a certain standard of care for animals. So that's the briefly, partially described, putatively possible world. Can the story of Samuel and the Amalekites be made to fit into a world of this sort? Now I'm skipping the section on identification of the story and resuming on page 45. To answer this question, it helps to reflect carefully on what the particular problems of the story about the Amalekites are supposed to be. What exactly is the matter with this story if we try to read it as literally true in the world I have described? At first glance, the answer seems easy and obvious. Someone might suppose that the God of the putatively possible world in the thought experiment could not will the death of a child or of any human being at any age. But clearly this is not right. In the world as I have described it, every human being who dies, everyone without exception, dies because that death is in accordance with God's will, either God's active will or God's permissive will. Without doubt, the death of human beings in general, and the death of children in particular, raises the problem of evil. Certainly it does. Of course it does. But here's the thing, the problem of evil can't be addressed adequately in passing in one short paper whose main focus is something other than the problem of evil in general. And I want the questions for the thought experiment at issue in this paper to focus not on the problem of evil in general, but on what is particular to the story of Samuel and the Amalekites. The death of human beings is not something particular to the story about the Amalekites. So for the sake of focusing the thought experiment, I want to add to the description of the putatively possible world of the thought experiment the stipulation that God has some morally sufficient reason for allowing the suffering of human beings and of animals, and that the morally sufficient reason includes benefits that defeat their suffering. On this stipulation, each sufferer is the protagonist of his own life story, and in that story his suffering is defeated by the benefits that accrue to him from his suffering. In making this stipulation, I am granting at the outset that nothing in this paper provides any help with the problem of evil in general. And here in my own defense, I want to say that I do have something to say about the problem of evil in general. And a 700-page book on that subject is now in production at Oxford, so I'm not really skipping it, I'm just skipping it here. For purposes of this paper, I want to examine the problems specific to the story about the Amalekites then, and not the problem of evil as a whole. Now I'm skipping the rest of this section and the next and resuming on page 47. There's a lot more that needs to be said about worries raised by the sufferings of the Amalekite people and their animals. And in the longer version of the paper that you have, I tried to remark on some of it. But I want to leave all of it to one side here in the interest of highlighting what seems to me a more difficult kind of worry that is raised by things that are specific to the story. Even if in the story what God commands the Israelite people doesn't count as murder on their part, and there's a paragraph in your text that says why I think not, nonetheless, it does seem that there is something morally deplorable in God's commanding the Israelite people to do this killing. It seems that there is something morally corrupting for the Israelites in their engaging in the wholesale killing of human beings and animals. And it is not compatible with God's goodness to will the moral corruption of human beings. So even if the death of all the Amalekites and the death of their animals were somehow compatible with the existence of a good God, as I have stipulated that it is in the putatively possible world of the thought experiment,